Chad Moyer with you here on the Rural Radio Network. Let's get an update from the Lower Elkhorn Natural Resources District, kind of talk about what they've been doing here recently, how they're dealing with the year so far, and kind of what the plans for the rest of the year looks like. Here to join us, Interim General Manager Brian Bruckner. Brian, thanks for joining us here today. First of all, let's just go right to the punch. We've been talking about rain or the lack of rain for most of last year and even into this year. So, as we sit here, the last full week in June, what do the drought maps look like? What seems to be the area that's most impacted by the drought, at least here in Nebraska, Brian?
Certainly. So, yes, thanks for having me on today, Chad. Always happy to share information with your listeners. I regret to report to you that the drought maps for this week have regressed to the negative once again. No surprise to anybody who lives in the area, who lives in the district. It's been hot and it's been dry, and the rains have been spotty. And while there have been some fortunate individuals, they have been so spotty that unfortunately the drought monitor maps that are released each Thursday morning at 8 o'clock show a regression of the conditions in not only in our district, but in the state as a whole. I looked earlier at the statistics, and I think as a state, I think the D3 area grew by 5%, the D4 area grew by a similar percentage. And so, unfortunately, the conditions and the precipitation that other parts of the world are currently experiencing are just not reaching our neck of the woods in any amount of any general coverage to provide us some relief. It's interesting. We have a son that lives in Colorado. He's working in Golden, and he calls us and said, it's raining again. That they're getting so much rain in Colorado. He actually traveled home earlier in the week, said that eastern Colorado was just as green as can be. Western Nebraska is as green as could be, and you get about halfway across Nebraska. And then once you reach that line, it's a pretty stark transition. And so good for them. They've been dry, just like we're experiencing now, but we keep our fingers crossed that this pattern would change. We experienced a historic drought in Norfolk in 2022. The National Weather Service has a station out at the Carl Stephan Airport. The period of record dates back to 1896, shattered any previous record. And we saw a general improvement early in 2023, and I was encouraged by that. I was hopeful that we had changed the trend, but unfortunately, we're slipping back into that deficit situation. We're not breaking records yet on the year, but it won't be long, and I'm sure we might be. So. Yeah.
So now, with as big and as broad as the Lower Elkhorn NRD is, with 15 counties, how does a district put together a plan, to try and respond to what's turning into a multi-year drought, Brian?
Right. Excellent question. So, why is the NRD interested in drought? Well, it's interested in drought because obviously being an agricultural district with a lot of irrigation and I would assume all of us, or at least most of us, dependent on groundwater as a primary resource for our needs every day, the drought and management of groundwater go hand in hand. A number of years ago, many of your listeners well remember the drought of 2012 and the impacts that it caused for their operation, potentially for their domestic well. In our district, we saw lots of situations where there were shortages reported, documented shortages due to the spike in demand. We saw a converse drop in groundwater supplies. Many well owners were forced to make modifications to their wells to restore their water supply. There were numerous circumstances where people had to construct new wells at a different location in a deeper part of the aquifer to restore their water supply. And so subsequently, in 2012, there was lots of emotion. There was lots of concern. There were lots of people saying to the NRD, what are you going to do? What can you do? Well, unfortunately, our response was we can't do anything right now because we can't shut irrigation wells off in season. We didn't have mechanisms to respond effectively, and emotions were running high, as I mentioned. And so from that experience came a lesson that the NRD needed to have a better strategy to respond away from a period of crisis. Okay. And so we went to task to develop a drought management plan and subsequently adopted a groundwater into our groundwater management plan, a drought management provision that is tied to the U.S. drought monitor maps that I mentioned as are produced each Thursday. And so theoretically, the board has within its authority to exercise its drought management strategy if conditions are acute enough or of significant severity. It could enact certain provisions in the district to basically temper demand or to limit groundwater use during periods of peak demand. And that's what it did last year. Okay. In late October, it imposed a 15-acre inch allocation on any irrigation well in the district that was not previously subject to a groundwater allocation. And that would be for any well located in any area in the district that's designated D3 or D4 on the weekly drought monitor maps. Okay. It also imposed a limit on municipal users, on municipal wells, of 250 gallons per capita per day on average. Okay. Because obviously we can't regulate one sector of the industry and not think about other sectors who are dependent on the resource as well. And of course, groundwater is a shared resource. We as residents and property owners in the state have the right to use the resource. But when it comes to time for us to all conserve, we need to all share in the conservation of that resource. And so that's why we also enacted a provision limiting uses on municipal wells. And so that's basically the situation we're living in now and why we're so keen on closely watching these drought monitor maps as they come out every week, because we've got wells who are on allocations now, and that is something that we have to administer in the district.
Okay. So just to clarify and make sure that we understand, for right now, as we sit in 2023, the allocation is the same as it was implemented at the end of last year?
So it implemented that measure at the end of last year for the upcoming pumping season. Okay. So the language of its plan, of our drought management plan, indicates that a board must enact any provision in response to that drought management strategy by the 1st of November of a calendar year for the future pumping season. That provides well owners ample notice, ample time to plan and respond accordingly as to, okay, if I need to adjust plant populations or whatever crop I'm going to plant, because I'm going to be dealing with a limit on how much irrigation water I have at my disposal, that it allows them sufficient time to plan accordingly, so on and so forth. So,
okay. So let's do a scenario where things get better. Let's say we start getting some rains and things green up, and maybe there's less stress on pumping, less the need to irrigate goes down. What would happen across the district if that would happen, at least from a regulatory standpoint?
Sure. So when the board enacted this 15-inch allocation late last year, it simultaneously enacted a separate provision that would release any well in a location in the district that on the U.S. drought monitor map has improved to a D2 designation, would be a less severe drought for a period of 14 consecutive days. And so therefore, that location, if it does improve, would be released from that allocation, and that allocation could not be reimposed for the balance of the pumping season. And we saw that improvement in portions of the district. Surprisingly enough, I mentioned some of the early precipitation that we saw. So long story short, if you looked at a map of our district that was impacted by this 15-inch allocation on the 1st of November of 2022, it was basically the entire district. We saw some ample precipitation, or we saw snowfall in portions of northern Pierce County. We saw some precipitation events in that neck of the woods. We also saw some precipitation on the southeast corner of our district that improved the map. So for a period of 14 consecutive days in 2 different frequencies, there were areas that have come out of this drought allocation requirement. And there's a good chunk of Pierce County. There's a portion of Northwest Madison County. There's a portion of Burt County, and there's a portion of Dodge County that have come out of those situations. However, if you looked at today's map, they've gone back into a D3 designation, but it's a moot point because that provision had been lifted because they met that 14-day minimum threshold. And so we have seen some areas of improvement based on precipitation, a variety of other indices that goes into producing these maps. But again, regrettably, with the conditions that we're currently continuing to experience, the drought maps have regressed to the negative side.
All right. So, Brian, let's take a moment and look a little bit forward. Again, we've got to get through this year first, right? But just, kind of thinking about 2024, when do the thoughts and when does the decision making on allocation start for the next growing season?
Sure. So if we stay in this scenario, if it stays dry as it has, we will keep our board informed on the status of things. We will be showing them the drought maps on a weekly basis. We will also be showing them water level information. So we have monitoring locations scattered throughout the district. We have 240 plus irrigation wells that we annually monitor for static water levels. We also have a dedicated network of our monitoring wells that have transducer devices that monitor changes in water levels in real-time basis, okay? So we'll be looking at those sorts of data, assessing the situation, bringing this information to the board's attention. The way this would work is that an ad hoc committee would form of board members, start conversations, review the information, and if they wanted to make a recommendation on any subsequent requirement for the 2024 pumping season, that would be their task, and they would need to do so and make a recommendation to the board at the end of October prior to that November 1st deadline. Let's hope that's all a moot point and that we're having precipitation that arrives and the situation improves, but I think we have to plan accordingly. I think most of us who are natives to Nebraska know that drought happens. It definitely happens. And it can happen in subsequent growing seasons. And that's kind of what we're experiencing. We have been fortunate I will say, that in 2012, that was more of a one-year phenomenon. 2013 was a much different year. And 2012 was the most recent acute drought that we've experienced. But now we're in the grips of year 2. And I think we could very well see year 3 or year 4. We've heard of these longer periods of drought from other parts of the United States, parts of California, and parts of the West. And so who are we to think that it maybe isn't our turn? I hate to admit it. So,
yeah. So I guess, Brian, just as we kind of wrap up, thoughts that this is very, this is not a knee-jerk thing, right? There's a lot of thought and time that goes into this. And you mentioned it before, that this is a shared situation, since we are talking about residential use, commercial use, and irrigation use. Everybody kind of shares when we have these situations, right?
That's for sure. As the Natural Resource District, we are tasked with ensuring that all users have sufficient supplies of the resource, okay? And while, again, we have huge demand from agriculture and realize that irrigation is so important to not only our district, to our area, but to the state as a whole, we need to be sensitive and responsible with managing the resource. I just want to say to your listeners that are we running out of water? Absolutely no. That's definitely not the statement or the message that I want to send. But there could be, if this drought continues as we go year to year to year with a spike in demand, we're not getting any recharge, okay? And when we don't get recharge, we start to see diminishing supplies. It's just like our savings accounts, just like our bank account. We have to put something back in if we are going to continue to use, or to use excessively especially. And so that's why the board developed this drought management scenario. to be able to respond to these situations, to be proactive, to try and get out ahead of these situations, because we certainly don't want conflicts to develop out there in the countryside. We want people to make sure that they're respectful to each other's needs, use the resource wisely. And there have definitely been a lot of improvements on that front. There's a lot of producers out there doing a lot of great things, growing a lot more bushels with a lot less resource. And so we've seen a lot of positive things come out of some of these negative circumstances.
Absolutely. All right. Brian, it's good to talk to you. Thank you so much for the update and the insight again, kind of on the situation as it sits right now. Brian Bruckner is the Interim General Manager of the Lower Elkhorn Natural Resources District. Joins us with this update here on the Rural Radio Network. Chad Moyer reporting. Here are a couple of bullet points, some take-home messages for you to remember about today's conversation. As a result of the 2012 drought, the LENRD did develop a drought management plan and subsequently integrated a drought response component into its groundwater management plan. And that utilizes those triggers that are tied to the U.S. Drought Monitor maps that come out every week. The drought response component does allow the board to enact certain provisions in the district to temper demand or limit groundwater use during some of those periods of peak demand. In late October of 2022, the board did impose that 15-inch per acre allocation on irrigation wells that had not previously been subject to allocations. That allocation did increase to 20 inches per acre as of the June 22nd, 2023 Board of Directors meeting. In October of last year, the board did simultaneously enact a separate provision. It would release any well in the district that is located within the D2 designation on the U.S. Drought Monitor for a period of 14 consecutive days from that allocation. That allocation could not be reimposed for the balance of the pumping season. The drought management plan does indicate the board must enact any provision in the response to that drought management strategy by November 1st. And don't forget, those drought monitor maps do come out every Thursday morning at 8 a.m.